Well, welcome. My name's Doug Bradburn. I'm the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I'm honored to be with you this morning. It's been a real tradition for me to come to the War College every year and talk about George Washington, the strategic leader, and I really want to extend my thanks to the new Commandant, Rear Admiral Cedric Pringle, who I haven't had a chance to meet, but I appreciate this opportunity again. And of course, Colonel Kelly Ward has been my point of contact, and it's just been fantastic to work with and really encouraging this format. And so I'm going to give it my talk. And normally I have the great honor of walking around that beautiful auditorium on the stage, and I bounce around a lot and I interact. And this time we're going to walk our way through a PowerPoint, which a lot of you are familiar with the way those work. And there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. I know that I have a great ally in the room with me, Matt Briney, who is monitoring the show and monitoring a Google Doc. And so put your questions in there and we'll get to them as we go forward. This is challenging for me because all I can see is a green light looking back at me, and I usually love to feed off the energy in the room. But I will warn you, I am a historian, and so I love to get my pound of flesh, and we're going to get a lot of history today. Because when we think about leadership and learning from leadership, there's a lot of conceptual ways to do that, and I think it's a great opportunity always when people have the time to reflect on their leadership. But history is an incredible way to pursue the lessons of leadership. In fact, all great military commanders should definitely be reading military history so that they have fewer body bags in their own experience. They can learn from the failures of others. They don't have to necessarily have to experience those and learn from experience. And that applies to all levels of leadership, and certainly to strategic leadership, which I know is what you all have been focusing on and focus on. Now, George Washington is, of course, well known as the father of our country, the United States of America. And I know there's a lot of students who are international students as well. And so my references to American history are going to be one of the ways we crawl through this. But the presidency of the United States is today one of probably the most important office of strategic leadership in the world, given the power of the United States and also the importance of that role in our system in this country, because the presidency combines both the head of state function, but also the kind of leader of policy. In this sense, it's party driven, but it's both a function to drive the strategic vision of the nation forward, but also represent and amplify the meaning of what the nation is and what its role should be in a fundamental way. So it has a powerful relationship to really setting the strategic goals of the whole nation. Now, George Washington invents that institution. The presidency is brand new, of course, at one point, and that's right after the Constitution. And the four things you're going to learn today in this lecture about George Washington is he promoted national unity and sentiment. He created a new national executive power. He established a path for economic independence and expansion and secured the nation from threats, foreign and domestic. And I'm going to get to that very shortly. But I want to start out with a little bit of an anecdote. I have here in front of me, and you can see on the PowerPoint there as well, some of the aspects of it. This is a book that was sold at auction for $9.8 million when Mount Vernon was creating a presidential library for George Washington. Now, the book in my hands isn't actually that book. This is a replica of the $9.8 million book. In fact, you can buy this book online at mountvernonshops.org right now for $34.95 or something like that. But let me tell you why this is such a valuable book and why it's so apropos, I think, to begin our lesson about George Washington as a strategic leader. First, what is it? It is the copy of all the laws passed by the first Congress of the United States after the Constitution. So Constitution is ratified in 1789. The first Congress meets in March of 1789, and George Washington is inaugurated as president in April. That session of Congress lasts all through the summer, March to September, and they create the government. They turn the Constitution from a piece of paper into a functioning government. They create the judiciary branch. They create the executive branch, the executive offices They create the first lighthouse bill, the first tax laws, and they also pass at the end of that session the amendments to the Constitution, which we know today is the Bill of Rights. So amendments that were hoped for in the ratification process and put in there. And George Washington is there through it all. In fact, he doesn't have much of an executive team at that point. He's basically alone, working hand in hand with James Madison in Congress to help stand up this new government, trying to develop precedents, trying to understand what's going on. And so at the end of that session, the Congress gives George Washington this book, or the book that this is a replica of. And you could see that it has, on its, in the binding, it says President of the United States. This is actually for him. It's bound and all that. It's got beautiful marbled pages. It has this bookplate in it, which shows ownership. And then, of course, it has this beautiful signature on the title page, Acts passed to the Congress of the United States. But it also has, at the beginning of it, a copy of the Constitution. And that brings us to our first sort of way to think about George Washington in the character of inventing this role of strategic leadership. As you know, Article 1 of the Constitution lays out the legislative branch, the Congress in the United States system. And in those areas where the congressional powers are mixed with our executive powers, like the veto, the president has a veto on all laws, like the treaty-making power, George Washington makes little brackets around those sections and writes president. Just very clearly in the margin, president, clearly marking out for himself those aspects of the legislative power that the president is involved in, that his office is involved in. Article 2 is all about the executive branch. It starts out the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And so right at the top, he writes president in the margins there. And as you get down through it, where it says he shall have power, he writes president powers. And down here where it says he shall take care the laws be faithfully executed, he writes required. So it's really an extraordinary document, not just an artifact of an incredible moment in American history, but an extraordinary window into the mind of George Washington. And here's a guy who's been president for 10 months, roughly. They've already stood up a number of laws, but he goes back and rereads the Constitution of the United States when he's preparing for that next session of Congress. Congress is coming back to New York, which is the capital at the time, coming back to New York to do its next session in early 1790. Washington's rereading the book at that time and marking it up in the margins. At the same time, he's also, in fact, the same day that he's doing this and preparing for his first State of the Union address, which is one of the things in Article 2 that's required to give an occasional State of the Union. He's going to greet Congress with a State of the Union address, and he writes a letter to Catherine Macaulay Graham, who I have quoted some of it here for you. She's a friend of George Washington's. She's an English woman, and she's she's not an American. And George Washington is sometimes difficult to get your arms around. He keeps people at arm's length. It's one of the aspects of the way he led, kept close counsel. And it's hard sometimes to get into his internal processes and thinking, but this is a great letter because of the moment and because of that book. And we can kind of see what he's thinking about as he's doing this. One of the things he writes is that the establishment of our government seemed to be the last great experiment for promoting human happiness by reasonable compact in civil society. It was to be in the first instance a government of accommodation as well as a government of laws. Much was to be done by prudence, much by conciliation, much by firmness. So here you have him reflecting on his moment. So here he is writing to her about the challenges that they face in creating this experiment in government. And what I love about this is the sense of him. Here is a man in full as a leader. He's been in positions of leadership in the military and in politics, broadly construed, really, since he was 21 years old. And here he is, he's 57 years old, and he notes, much was to be done by prudence, much by conciliation, much by firmness. Great leaders understand that there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of ways to get what you need. Sometimes you have to conciliate. Sometimes you have to push it through. Sometimes you have to be prudent and wait for your moment. When you do that, that's the art of leadership. That's the challenge of understanding your moment, your institution, your values, your mission, your goals. But Washington clearly understands this, that there's a lot of ways to get things done, and he's impressed at all the things he was able to get done. But he also goes on and talks about the uniqueness of his moment. In our progress towards political happiness, my station is new. I walk on untrodden ground. There's scarcely any action whose motives may not be subject to a double interpretation. There's scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent. This is such a powerful passage of Washington's state of mind in that moment. Congress is coming back. He recognizes he's walking in the shoes of nobody. He's trying to create a new executive office in a country that has never had an effective executive over any kind of distance of power, and certainly across the colonies, across the states, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But he's not a monarch. He has to represent a nation. On the other hand, he has prerogative power, and he is setting precedents for all that would come after him. He's thinking about the long term. He's not thinking about, but he also is recognizing the news cycle in a sense, and the role of public opinion in his position, in this system, in the particular character of the American system. His motives may be subject to a double interpretation. We see that all the time with strategic leaders, right? There's always the motive that you can put on someone that's cynical or negative, because you don't always understand where they're coming from, and sometimes they are operating in a way that's not perhaps in the public good or in the broader good. And Washington recognizes that. The sensitivity to his role as a political actor in that moment is the first lesson I want to emphasize that all great strategic leaders have. Self-awareness, aware of your own time and your own place in your institution. Where is it moving when you are in that position? What is the nature of the group that you lead? Why are you in that role? What is your purpose there? And then how is it affecting you? Being aware of your own limitations and your own legacy that you are crafting in that moment. This is a self-awareness that all great strategic leaders have shown. And I would argue it's sort of one of those universal qualities that human beings who are able to lead in moments of conflict, chaos, complication, in a strategic capacity, are highly self-aware of themselves and their moment and their institution's moment. Their role therein. In Washington's case, it's new, of course, but he also understands the trajectory that's got him here. The whole ratification process, the coming out of retirement to help form a more perfect union, and then getting it ratified, and now getting in this office, and then, first standing up the very beginnings of the office. He is in this role, and he's the one who has responsibility to think about the long-term precedents that he's creating. And it really is a great letter to help us get inside that head. So self-awareness. And there's a flip side to the coin of self-awareness that's crucial to all great strategic leaders. And you would have heard this a lot of times, in all your leadership courses and your leadership conversations: vision, strategic vision. And in the case of my usage here as a flip side of self-awareness, vision is really the big picture. It's the purpose of the action. And it's where you want to go and where this institution is going. And in Washington's case, the presidency is not an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end. And that end is the independence of the United States of America, so that it is strong and stable and able to thrive into the future. The presidency is one of many ways that vision can be achieved. Washington sees himself as playing a crucial role in that period, but he never wanted to be president to be president. When you see a politician saying, they're running, and it just sounds like they just are running because they want to be president or they want to have that role, and they're not articulating a vision for what they're going to do in that office, they're not going to be a strategic leader. They're not going to be a successful communicator. They're not going to be able to persuade and bring people along. And they're not going to be able to manage challenges of crisis very well, because having a vision is what keeps you stable and moored in times of confusion and fog and difficulty. So let's look at some of Washington's sense of vision. So this is a letter he wrote at the end of the American War for Independence. Famously, he retires his commission in Annapolis goes back to a private station at Mount Vernon. And he doesn't say mission accomplished. He doesn't say it's over. Let the good times roll. He actually says the hardest stuff is yet to come. And this is a great part of a letter that he wrote as a circular to the governors of the states upon his retirement. And he says, the citizens of America are actors on a most conspicuous theater. The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than in any former period. And at this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. And he goes on, as you see here, it appears to me there's an option still left to the United States of America, that it is in their choice and depends on their conduct whether they will be respectable and prosperous or contemptible and miserable as a nation. This is the time of their political probation. This is the moment when the eyes of the whole world are upon them. For according to the system of policy they adopt, they will stand or fall. And by their confirmation or lapse, it's yet to be decided whether the revolution must ultimately be considered as a blessing or a curse, not to the present age alone, for with our fate will the destiny of unborn millions be involved. Unborn millions. Washington's vision is transhistorical. He recognizes that the experiment that they've created in the war for independence and the possibility of creating an independent nation is going to impact millions to come. And he wants to see it succeed. He understands that it's the choices and the policies that are created. And ultimately, the presidency for him is one of those ways that he's trying to achieve the stability and the success of the war, the Revolutionary War, for the future of the nation. So he comes into this office reluctantly, but with big stakes for him, with a big vision for what's possible here and what is to come. And he expresses this aspects of this vision, throughout the 1780s as he's entering the office of the presidency in his formal addresses, to different governors and thanking people, his first speeches to the Congress. But one of the things he's emphasizing, is the national importance of the work. Let prejudices, unreasonable jealousies, and local interests yield to reason and liberality. Let us look to our national character and to things beyond the present period. We need a stronger government, and he's going to help birth it and lead it into the future. So that's the first emphasis I wanted to make in this talk, that all great strategic leaders have a dual sense of awareness, right? A dual sense of, on the one hand, the self-awareness of their own moment, their own context, their own responsibilities in the specific office they're in, their own sense of how it's affecting them, their own sense of how they're doing, their own sense of what the immediate challenges are. But at the same time, they have a broader vision for why they're in that role at all. If the role is the point, there is no vision. Then the role is all just about self-awareness and self-aggrandizement and power. But if the role is intending to create something else, if they have that vision, as a strategic leader, they're going to be much more effective. They're going to be able to manage challenges, and they're going to be able to move an institution in a direction, as long as they can persuade others that their vision makes sense. And presumably, if you've achieved that role, one of the reasons you have is because of this articulation. And so those are the key things I want to lay out first as we get into the real grist of the history. All right, so the Washington administration. What are the 4 things that are essential for you to know about the Washington administration that'll help you understand George Washington as a strategic leader and this country a little bit? First off, he promoted national unity and sentiment. And I mentioned these quickly before, so I'll blow through them again and get into the grist of it. Created a new national executive power. I'll talk about that. Established a path for economic independence and expansion, and to secure the nation from threats, foreign and domestic. Much of this story is a story about creation and survival of a new untested system across thousands of miles that had never been united before with any kind of government. And so the first one, that Washington promoted national unity and sentiment, is really the place to begin. The presidency has a unique role in our system in that it is the only office that's intended to represent the whole nation, everyone in the nation. It isn't so much that everybody votes for the president, but the president represents the nation in that process of choosing and electing a president. Folks in the House of Representatives represent their districts, people in the Senate represent their states, but the president represents the nation as a whole and has this dual role as head of state, but also, a political figure who's shaping policy and executing policy as well. Now, the United States had a very loose sense of identity. They had been 13 different colonies that had different economies that had developed in different ways. They, in many ways, had a diverse population. So, for instance, in Pennsylvania, at the time of the American Revolution, 1/3 of everybody in Pennsylvania spoke German. You had completely different religious practices in New England than you had in some of the southern colonies. You had slavery in the southern colonies. You had different economies and oriented in different ways. New England was, trading with the West Indies. The southern colonies were trading with Europe. It wasn't an integrated economy, and it wasn't an integrated culture. The war had helped them cling together because they had a cause, which is to fight for independence. But without the war, we saw in the 1780s the country really start to pull apart again. So George Washington understood that one of the fundamental purposes of his role in this moment was to promote national unity, a sense of sameness, a sense of oneness. And he did this not only with his rhetoric, and I've already read some of it, he also did it with his actions. And one of the things he did was he toured all over the country when he was president. He went to every state in the Union. He presented himself to the people in this very public manner, partly to hear and learn what people thought of the new government, but also to show the new government to people, to get it into their lives in a tangible way and show himself. He was the one man really known widely throughout the area. So in his first year in office, he goes to New England, for instance, and he goes to the town of Boston, which at the time is fairly small. It's only 16,000 people, really what we would consider a village. But in fact, Washington had a parade there that had 17,000 people. So it's the whole community. It's not just the political community. It's everybody. It's boys and girls and women and men and all ethnicities, all religions come out to see Washington. And this becomes an important part of Washington's impact on shaping a national story about who they are and what makes them distinct. And so you can see even today, all these incredible, markers of Washington's tours, and George Washington slept here, and Washington's impact and the memory of Washington is something that's going to last not only in his own presidency, but to this present day. You can go to these places from Maine to Georgia, and they're still marking the history of Washington's visit in this unique, tangible way. And so that's a crucial part of it. The other thing, when we think about how Washington did this, he performed the office of the presidency. He performed the role. And in this case, I think all strategic leaders need to do this. They need to function as someone performing the role based on the culture of the institution, based on the expectations of leadership. But they got to own it. They've got to own the leadership role that's there for them. And here's a quote from John Adams that he wrote to Benjamin Rusk in 1811. Of George Washington. He was the best actor of the presidency we have ever had. His address to the states when he left the army, his solemn leave taken of Congress when he resigned his commission, his farewell address to the people when he resigned his presidency, these were all in the strain of Shakespearean excellence in dramatical exhibitions. And we think about that performative role of the office of the president. Washington played it to a T. When he would go into these towns, he would get out of his carriage and get on a white horse and ride in on horseback. He was representing the leader that people wanted to imagine he was. And he put that, that incredible sense of confidence, strength, integrity, power into tangible ways for people. So powerfully that, even today, Washington to us, seems very abstract, and it's hard to get at the human man himself. That's how effective he was in representing this office in a way of stability at a time of incredible instability. This is one of the weakest polities that has ever been. I mean, they've gone through a revolution. They're barely clinging together. When he comes into office, there's no economy to speak of. I love this painting of his arrival in New York for his inauguration, where he's standing on the boat. Washington apparently doesn't ever ride in a boat when he's not standing up. It's amazing. to see him like this. But it again speaks to the theatrical character of the world that Washington inhabits. That power plays out in front of the people in these ways that are performative. And George Washington was very much a man of his era in that sense. But you also think of other presidents in American history and the way they inhabited that role. Lincoln was a great storyteller. He was also a great orator. Washington was not necessarily an orator, so that was not the area that he would emphasize. But you think about the fact we've had an actor in the presidency, Ronald Reagan, who was quite effective as a communicator and a stage setter. You remember his meetings with Gorbachev, when Gorbachev has the hat on and looks all frumpy, and Reagan has got no overcoat, and he's like running up the stairs to see him. This kind of dramatic stagecraft is important in strategic leadership, and it manifests a broader sense that Washington brought to this role. And when we think about people saying, well, he's not acting presidential, or someone isn't behaving presidentially, somewhere deep in the recesses of our minds, that goes back to an image and a character in office that was created originally by George Washington. What does a president look like? What does a president act like in office? Is an important thing. The other thing in that role of promoting unity and sentiment is that Washington also, in the presidency, has this unique role, and often strategic leaders have this role, to reveal the aspirational goals of a people and of a society and of an institution. What makes your institution distinctive? Why should we be proud of it? In Washington's case, when he traveled around all these places, he would get letters from, the Chamber of Commerce and from the local churches, and he would always respond to these letters. And the letters are like, thank you so much for supporting the fishing rights of our great sailors here in Marblehead, Massachusetts. And he would respond, yes, the fisheries are as important of anything to build, manly seamen, and the importance of strength to national power and all that. And some of those, and they were all published in the newspapers and scattered far and wide. And so one of those that's very important in this context is a letter that he responded to from the Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island. He wrote, they asked him, in Rhode Island, Jews had been allowed tolerance of their religion going back into the 17th century, and they were worried about whether or not that would continue under this new system of government. There's a new constitution, are we going to have those rights? And Washington actually wrote back saying, it's no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed their exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, and giving it on all occasions their effectual support. To bigotry no sanction. It's an incredibly powerful argument about the right of freedom of conscience in America, in this new government, under this new system. And it's powerful because he published this, and it's sent all over the country, all over the world, at a time before the First Amendment to the Constitution was passed, and at a time when it's not even true. The government of the United States allowed all kinds of bigotry. I mean, there was racism, there was slavery, there were limitations on the civil rights of outsiders, and even in the religious context, you still had established religions in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut. If you were a Baptist in Massachusetts, you still had to pay to support the clergyman of the town, what the majority of the town had chosen. And so it's an aspirational sentiment, and powerful because it's aspirational, because what it says is, this is why the government of the United States is different. This is what we hope to become. And this statement, is very important today amongst the Jewish community in the United States. It's very important to the way we think about the history of religious freedom in this country. And Washington, as a strategic leader, could lay those bars out there about what they're trying to be and who we are, that have an impact. And that's an important part of what he did in this presidency. So that's the gist: promoted national unity and sentiment in a time when the country didn't really know what they had in common at all. The second point of his presidency, creating a new national executive power. All right, well, what do I mean by that? First off, there had never been a national executive power that had been effective at all across these 13 colonies. And in fact, you think about it, the British had tried to create one, and that led to the American Revolution. at the end of the 7 Years' War, the British trying to get a hold of a couple of things. One, they need to raise revenue from their colonies. They need to tax them in an orderly way where they can have some kind of strategic, control over the way these colonies function, the way they function in the empire. But also, they want to control the West. They want to control settlement into the West. These two challenges are things that George Washington also is going to have to confront. How do you create a government that's going to be able to be stable and collect taxes across all these different colonies? And how do you control the West and the flow of people in the West and the policy in the West? And so the institution building that has to happen has to be done in a very delicate way. It's one thing to ratify the Constitution. It's a whole nother thing to put into place an institution that can, on the one hand, gather intelligence from a country that's thousands of miles apart, at a time before telephones, before cable wires, at a time when people can only move as fast as they could in the Roman Empire. How do you gather information? How do you project power in a system where you don't have any officers on the ground? First, you've got to gather all those officers. You have to appoint them. You've got to figure out your decision making. Now, in strategic leadership, I worked with Colonel Greg Schultz, who's at the Defense University in strategic leadership, and he always talked about internal challenges of strategic leaders. Internal challenges being those things in the institution that they have to manage or they can control. There's the management challenges of who's in what position and how they understand what their role is and how you get them to execute what your strategic vision is. There's the culture of an institution, and that can mean a lot of things, but it's something a strategic leader needs to understand. Can often change, but has to change it carefully, or can maybe establish it in the case of Washington, setting up the culture of an institution. And then there's the processes of decision making. How do you decide in a way that reflects the institution's values and culture and management structure? How do you make sure you get buy-in? In the United States, we have a consensus-based leadership process here. It's one thing to be able to give an order and people have to obey it. But in strategic leadership levels, you're dealing with all kinds of variables that you can't just give an order to. You have to be aware of public opinion. You've got to be aware of other institutions. And in your own institution, it's complicated. Strategic leaders have to wear lots of different hats. They have to be the people that can manage folks. They have to be able to articulate the vision, communicate it. They got to figure out processes of decision making, and they got to move quickly. In fact, strategic leaders, sadly, I know a lot of you identify yourselves as warriors. Strategic leaders have to be politicians. They have to be politicians not in the party sense, not in the sense that they're running for office and stumping. They've got to be aware of how power is shaped in their institutions and where the touchstones are that allow that power to be exercised without creating conflict and chaos, or at least understanding when there's likely to be conflict. If you make a decision that a big chunk of the organization is going to not like, how do you prepare in advance to manage those expectations, to manage that division of your institution? Political awareness, a sense of how things get done in the institution. And you can change that as a strategic leader. It's not set in stone, but every institution has their kind of own mojo that you need to, as a strategic leader, try to comprehend and get around. And Washington, in trying creating a new national executive power, has these same internal challenges, and he masters them very well. And I'm going to mention a little bit of culture and then a little bit on decision making to get through this a little more quickly. One of the things he has to do is appoint people to new offices. So you create new laws that allow you to collect customs duties. You got to appoint customs officers in every port. You got to appoint justices. You got to appoint marshals. You got thousands of people to appoint as the president of this new government. There's no civil service. There's no civil service exams. There's no schools that produce people. So how do you find the right people? And then what are your standards to appoint these people? Are you just going to appoint your friends? Are you just going to appoint politically expedient people that are handed to you? George Washington set a very high bar for his appointments, and he had a very small tolerance for people who didn't live up to that bar. He would appoint people and he would remove people. He would remove them if they did not live up to his standards of integrity, of professionalism, of competence in the office. And this was a standard that he pushed. And so here's a good quote on appointments. I mean, you read his correspondence in the early 1790s, it's thousands of people asking for offices, many of whom don't know him, many of whom know somebody that served with him, for 8 years in the war. But of course, that's lots of people. Washington was in the Army for 8 years in the American Revolution. Everybody in the country knew somebody who knew somebody who knew George Washington. And it's really a remarkably small place in a way. And so this letter, I think, speaks to the culture and appointments, his own thinking and processing, but also something that he pushed. The necessity in a variety of instances of hardening my heart against indulgences of my warmest inclinations and friendships, and from a combination of causes, as well as mere fitness of character, to depart from first impressions and first intentions with regard to nominations, which has proved most unequivocally the propriety of the maxim I had adopted of never committing myself until the moment when the appointment is to be made, when from the best information I can obtain and a full view of the circumstances my judgment is formed. So Washington is taking very seriously the stocking of this new executive office with the right people. When a strategic leader surrounds themselves with non-effective leaders, with people who have no integrity and don't make clear what the standards are, they themselves will reflect that weakness. Strategic leaders set the culture of an institution by explaining what's expected and by choosing people that are going to live up to those expectations, and then by getting rid of them when they don't. In fact, Washington, most famously in one of the scandals of his administration, there was his own good friend, his Secretary of State at the time, Edmund Randolph, who'd been his own personal lawyer, going back for 25 years, when there was a hint, no evidence, but just a hint of impropriety of him taking bribes from the French in a critical moment. He pushed him out of the cabinet. He pushed him out immediately, and they never had a friendship again after that. Washington, had like the old maxim, you have to be like Caesar's wife, essentially. You have to be beyond reproach. There cannot even be the hint of corruption in this new executive department that he's creating. One of the examples we see, though, also of the flexible way that he created a new institution in the face of how do you manage and exercise decision-making, how do you project power, is the way he uses executive officers in the creation of the cabinet. Again, in strategic leaders in their internal challenges need to understand how do they make decisions. And they need to try to do that in a time when it's not a crisis, because, of course, then they'll be able to respond better in the midst of a crisis. And Washington gradually evolved into the management structure of a cabinet in which each of the executive officers of the different departments, were brought in to hear their points of view. He always tried to get consensus across the board. When he would have a meeting, he wouldn't dictate, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do. I want you to put into place. He would ask questions, or in advance, he would send out questions in advance, and they would come prepared to talk out the different approaches. And the other thing he would do when he made decisions in this manner, he would also talk about the next steps so that everybody understood not only what the decision was, but when it was going to be implemented, how it was going to be communicated, how it was going to be executed. So he was a very deliberate leader who emphasized listening in this case. Now, I want to read a couple of quotes. Oh, I got to go back. Sorry. I got to read a couple of quotes about his management style. Here at George Washington's Mount Vernon in our Executive Leadership Institute, we often talk about the importance of management, leadership, and strategy and how they're connected together. And Washington exemplified that in the way that he worked with his cabinet, as we'll see. Now, here are some quotes. I'm just going to read a series of quotes of other people who knew George Washington and reflected on him as a leader. So here's Alexander Hamilton. Washington consulted much, pondered much, resolved slowly, resolved surely. Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps the strongest feature in his character was prudence, never acting until every circumstance, every consideration was maturely weighed, refraining if he saw a doubt, but when once deciding, going through with his purpose, whatever obstacles opposed. John Adams wrote, no man, I believe, has influence with the president. He seeks information from all quarters and judges more independently than any man I know. Edward Thornton, who was a British diplomat, a British ambassador, Washington possesses, quote, the two great requisites of a statesman, the faculty of concealing his own sentiments and of discovering those of other men. Gouverneur Morris wrote, he beheld not only the affairs that were passing around, but those also in which he was personally engaged with the coolness of an unconcerned spectator. Finally, John Marshall, Chief Justice, later friend of Washington, when decisions were made, they were seldom, if ever, to be shaken. Washington would often write to his cabinet, deliberate maturely, but execute promptly. What these quotes tell us is in the character of the way Washington functioned as an executive strategic leader, listening first, being calm in the moment, making decisions based on judgment, and once decisions are made, move forward with an execution of that decision. It worked for him very successfully in the presidency. It was key to the way he got things done. The cabinet and consensus building allowed him political cover. These men were from different regions of the country. These men, he tried to make them all speak with one voice. It allowed him to be efficient, and it allowed them independence from the political work that's going on in Congress. It's interesting because it's not inevitable in the Constitution. The Constitution only says that the president can from time to time request in writing the opinion of the executive officers. It's not clear that Congress also can't just directly interact with the cabinet. Washington establishes very clearly that the cabinet works through him and that the executive branch works through the president's office rather than just being a collection of people in an executive that Congress is really calling on. The other thing he does is he separates the cabinet from the political apparatus of the Senate. The Constitution asks for the Senate to advise and consent on treaties and assumes that the Senate's going to play some role as a conciliar body to the president. Washington realizes very quickly the Senate is not secret enough. It's too political, and he can't control it. He can't get rid of a senator when he doesn't like one. And so the cabinet emerges really as the fundamental counsel of George Washington. The final thing I'll say about this, so when Jefferson comes into power as president of the United States, he emulates the way his cabinet would operate based on his experience of George Washington's cabinet. He writes a great circular to the heads of department, November 6, 1801. Let me read it for you. George Washington formed a central point for the different branches, preserved a unity of object and action among them, exercised that participation in the gestion of affairs which his office made incumbent on him, and met himself the due responsibility for whatever was done. Jefferson describes Washington's role as being like the center of a wheel that knew what all parts were doing and also took responsibility, although delegating the power to the requisite departments. By doing that, he could communicate with all parts of the Union. He could take responsibility for the choices and decisions that were being made, but he could also execute them using the expertise that he had. And it really was one of the extraordinary things that he created, a lasting model for how a new power could work in a way that it had never functioned in North America. All right. He also established in his presidency a path for economic expansion and innovation. And this is really one of the crucial things that's important to understand about Washington's administration. When he entered office, the United States economy was basically on life support. They had no trade with any European power of any note. The British had squeezed them out of all their markets because of the Navigation Acts. There was very little money changing hands, and the country itself, the United States itself, was deep in debt. It had huge debt that was owned to its own citizens, owned to the states, owed to foreign governments. And so Washington really transformed that. By the end of his administration, so here's what John Jay wrote about it in 1811, reflecting back on Washington's presidency, quote, his administration raised the nation out of confusion into order, out of degradation and distress into reputation and prosperity. It found us withering, it left us flourishing. Now, one of the things, right here you see these three circles. There are really three things that were really crucial in an impact of creating an economy that was innovative, that could expand, and really fundamentally establish the real economic independence of the United States so that they could manage their own affairs without foreign interference. The policies that they pursued, his emphasis on the rule of law, and the trust that Washington himself projected in that office that other countries and other people in the states recognized and allowed flexibility for the country to go forward. Trust is, of course, the more squishy of all these things, but it's no doubt as crucial, and I'll get to that very shortly. The policies that Washington chose, I don't have time to go into the details of them, right? This is the Hamilton's economic plans, the assumption of all the debts of the United States, the funding them at par, the finding a way to pay them off, the creation of a bank to help manage the monetary policy of this young country. It's a financial revolution. The Dutch had done it, the British had done it, and the Americans did it in their American Revolutionary in this moment. And it allowed the United States to establish their public credit, allowed them to have a very confident way of funding it over the long term, and really established the idea that the dollar was, well, it wasn't the dollar at the time, but the American credit and American promises would be kept. It was politically unpalatable to a lot of people. And anytime you're a strategic leader and you're making new policies that are going to change things, there's going to be political blowback. There's going to be difficulties. Washington managed these on a personal level between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, tried to get them to work together, kept them in the cabinet long enough to get these policies in place to start showing their effect, so that they would go on to become essential to the country. The second thing is the rule of law. So one of the things that's controversial about the funding and financial policies of the United States is, how are you going to pay for all this debt that you've assumed and confidently said you're going to pay it all off at 100% on the dollars owed? Well, you have new taxes, of course, and one of those is an excise tax on whiskey. It's a tax on the production of whiskey. It's not a consumption tax. And this is really unfair to people in Western Pennsylvania, their living is basically, a lot of it is based on distilling their grains into whiskey so they can get it to markets in the East. There are no great roads over the mountains. It's more expensive to get wheat and other grains long distances to marketplaces. And so this is seen as an assault on the West. And so you see insurrection. You see opposition to this law. It's seen as unfair. And they had a point, but it was a legal law. It was passed by the Congress, which has the power to do that in the Constitution. And Washington, as the executive officer, needs to make sure that the law is upheld. It's an emphasis for him on the rule of law as much as anything here. And this is a great quote, as you see here. If the laws are to be so trampled upon with impunity in a minority, a small one too, is to dictate to a majority, there's an end put at one stroke to Republican government, and nothing but anarchy and confusion is to be expected thereafter. For some other man or society may dislike another law and oppose it with equal propriety until all laws are prostrate, and every one, the strongest one, I presume, will carve for himself. The whole purpose of being able to govern yourself is to be able to pass laws that people have to obey. And America is a difficult place to lead. We had gone through a revolution. And if these laws were passed and then just ignored, the United States would have become a banana republic in the very beginning. It wouldn't have been able to function. It wouldn't have been able to achieve the policy goals that are put forward, and it wouldn't have been able to confidently invest in its future. Finally, on the trust point that I mentioned briefly, what does the full faith and credit of the United States mean at a time before they've ever paid any of their debts? The United States had never paid any debts going back to 1775, when the Continental Congress first started taking on debt in the name of the United States of America. Well, the trust factor was George Washington's reputation, something he had built up over a long period of time. Strategic leaders have to develop trust to be effective and to be trusted in what they say and what they do. If you don't have a long example of trust to build upon, it hampers your effectiveness as a strategic leader, because again, you've got to bring lots of constituencies along. You can't just order things and snap your fingers. You've got to bring a complicated world into relation. And that gets us to our final and crucial point about George Washington's presidency. He secured the nation from threats, foreign and domestic. I've been going on a long time, so I want to finish this up, and we'll have time for questions if there's more specific questions about the foreign affairs character of Washington's presidency. But again, strategic leaders face those internal challenges that they can control and they can influence them, how to manage people, how to appoint people, how to influence the culture. What is the culture of the institution? What is the decision-making process going to be? But there are external challenges that they cannot control, that they have to be able to respond to. And every president has seen this. You think about presidents who are running for office and they always have their agendas and the things they're going to do. Take George W. Bush, for instance. If you go back and read his speeches before he becomes president, nothing in there, recognizes that, well, there might be a big 9/11 event in the first year of his presidency, which is going to change everything. An external challenge that he can't control, that he has to respond to, and is going to shape the legacy of his leadership. Similarly with George Washington. George Washington becomes president in April of 1789, and immediately, within a month and a half, you have the fall of the Bastille in Paris, the beginning of the French Revolution. One of the most important things in Western history that happens, the explosion of the Ancien regime of France, which is going to transform the face of Europe, really the birth of democratic governments in Europe over, obviously, over a long period of time, but really transformative. And the next 5 presidents are going to have to deal with foreign affairs infected by the French Revolution and its various stages. So it's not until really 1816, with the fall of Napoleon, that the French Revolution and its consequences are not going to impact American policy, politics, and leadership. And so Washington has to face that right away. And so in the midst of that, you've got to mitigate this crisis. You have to have strategic agility. You have to have strategic patience. You've got to remember, what is that vision? What is the purpose again? Why are you in this office? What are you trying to achieve? And a number of things Washington does achieve in this transformative moment. He keeps the United States from being sucked into the war politics between Great Britain and France, because the French Revolution turns into a world war with the French and the enthusiasts for the revolution against the princes of Europe, and it flows everywhere and infects a lot of different countries. A lot of countries are overthrown in Europe because they can't stay out of this politics. They can't keep their own citizens from really demanding that they get into the war. And Washington successfully does that. The French Revolution is a good example of Washington doing that. So, for instance, John Adams will write about Philadelphia in the age of the French Revolution. He's writing to Jefferson many, many years later, saying, "You were not there in Philadelphia when 10,000 people in the streets, day after day, threatened to drag Washington out of his house and effect a revolution in government and compel it to declare war in favor of the French Revolution and against England. The coolest and firmest minds were the only thing that kept us going." And then he also says the yellow fever saved them from collapsing as well, which there was a yellow fever epidemic which broke out in Philadelphia in that late summer of 1793. Washington had to manage public opinion, and he established the separation of powers in this crisis. He declared neutrality, kept the United States out of the fight, and ultimately would prevail. There's a great quote I have here that George Washington wrote about this time, and really about what is his strategic grand strategy in the face of this. He says, "It's well known that peace has been, to use a modern phrase, the order of the day with me, since the disturbances in Europe first commenced. For sure I am, if this country is preserved in tranquility 20 years longer, it might bid defiance in a just cause to any power whatsoever. Such will be its population and resources in that time." Washington had a long view. He understood his moment. He understood that the worst possible thing that could happen to this new country would be a major international war. It just needed time. He needed time for the country to grow. The population of the United States had been, the population of the colonies, and then the United States had been doubling for 20 years, since about 1700. And that meant that Washington understood this. This was something Benjamin Franklin had written about in the 1750s, and Washington and Franklin talked all the time. And so this idea that you could just if you could hold the country together long enough, instill enough national feeling, calm people down, keep people moderate, pursue your policies, enforce the law, within 20 years, you'll be safe from any army. No one would conquer the United States again, certainly not with the technology of the 19th century. The United States might lose wars, but it wouldn't be destroyed as an entity itself. And Washington had that strategic vision, which served him well. Now, of course, he didn't keep out of fighting all the time. He fought wars that they could win and that made sense over time. And Washington's relations with Native Americans bear talking about briefly, and I'll be happy to answer more questions about it. But essentially, when Washington comes to office, he's confronted with small grade fighting on the frontiers, both in the southeast of the United States and also in the Ohio Valley. They don't control the territory that they claim to control. He has an army of only 600 people when he comes into office as president. That's how small the United States Army was at the time that it claims half the continent, all the way to the Mississippi River, essentially, a third of the continent. And yet the continent is occupied by British troops. The Spanish are hostile in New Orleans. The Western settlers can't trade through the Mississippi River. And then this Confederacy war breaks out. Washington fails twice trying to defeat the Native Americans in the Ohio Valley, ultimately raises an army led by Mad Anthony Wayne and destroys the Confederacy in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which you see depicted here. But most of his success with Native Americans was actually diplomatic. Again, recognizing the limits of what he could do, keeping Native Americans out of a Confederacy. He would have dinners regularly with different Native Americans who would visit him, and was able. So he had the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Miami. I mean, all these groups of Native Americans, the Iroquois, who would come have dinner with him. He would distribute peace medals. He would assure a favor of the United States, and it worked. Now, people can criticize the Indian policy of George Washington in the United States from the perspective of the 21st century and our sense of what was just in that period. But from his point of view, in the perspective of the 18th century, he had tremendous success getting access to Native American land, which was claimed by the United States, and being able to control Western settlement in a way that would assure the strength and lasting character of the United States. So, to wrap it up then, Washington created this incredible office of strategic leadership. The country was bankrupt when he came into power. He couldn't control all these borders. By the end of it, he had established the credit of the United States so that the country could be independent and manage its own finances without dependence on foreign money and foreign control. He had achieved the navigation rights of the Mississippi River, as well as a clear southern border in negotiating with the Spanish without the fire of a shot, gotten access to the eventual settlement of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. He defeated the Western Confederacy of Native Americans and established a boundary on the Mississippi. And he kept the United States out of the politics of world war at a time when the ancient republics of Genoa, Venice, Switzerland, the Dutch Republic fell to the revolutionary allure and the armies of France and the demand for war. In doing these, he invented the presidency of the United States. He created precedents in that office which have stood for over 220 years, and now has become the most powerful office of strategic leadership in the world. Now, you all are the future leaders of the nation and the world. It's an important moment that we're living through right now with the crisis, and I hope everybody's healthy and safe at home. We have a great leadership challenge now, but the leadership challenge of the future is going to be even bigger, because the question of what we're going to do when we come out of this, what are our relations going to be like with the rest of the globe? Are we going to have a more effective, just world? What are our relationships with our own citizens going to be like? What are the health standards that we're going to demand? What is the way we're going to work together to get things done in an environment where we've seen so many frustrations of leadership here and there? The other thing I would say, though, before we transition to questions, is that all the great successes in American history, American Revolution, Civil War, the World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, they've all been marked by failures in the beginning, particularly large-scale failures and frustrations and venality and corruption. And so we ultimately tell a story of great success, but it's messy, and it requires leadership who have vision to help bring the country through. Hopefully one of you all will become president of the United States at some point. And if you do, I hope you lead like Washington. So let's turn it over to some questions now, if we have any, and we'll get down to business here. So Matt, what do we got?
Yeah, Doug, we have from Jeff Thirnherter of the U.S. Army. How do you think President George Washington would handle the COVID-19 crisis? What actions would he take as leader to rally the nation to fight the virus?
It's a great question, and apropos to our conversation, George Washington, as I pointed out, in a crisis, he managed with patience and with judgment, but also with agility. So he would put the structures in place that would allow him to execute. He would emphasize the importance of a national effort and the united character of the suffering, as well as the sacrifices that were essential. This is a message that he had used all throughout 8 long years of the American Revolution. Sacrifices required to serve the public good. That is the whole purpose of virtuous citizenship. And as a leader, he tried to emulate that in his own choices and his own actions. He would listen, and when choices were made, he would execute. And I think that model that Jefferson emphasizes of Washington being at the center of things, but allowing the distribution and delegation of authority to the departments where it belonged, allowed him to take responsibility, but at the same time have a unified approach and be effective. And so Washington would be flexible in that way. His experience was never one of an autocrat. He was never one that wanted to get the limelight. But he would see it as something that needed to be mastered through good organization, good communication, and judgment.
And Doug, from Matt Faust from the Department of Defense, building off of Jeff's question, how do you think the uncertainties and strategic leadership challenges of the revolution compared to global challenges such as pandemics and climate change are the same balance and emphasis of leadership qualities required?
Yeah. So how does the challenges of Washington facing the American Revolution, for instance, relate to the challenge of a pandemic? I've been thinking about this a lot myself, as I'm an institutional leader here at Mount Vernon, and of course we're closed. A massive amount of our revenue is dependent upon visitation. So I've got a staff of over 600 that we need to figure that out. You all know, and Clausewitz and strategic leadership in the fog of war, right? There's a sense that the lack of knowing is so palpable right now, because the long-term planning is limited by the fact that we can only see so far, and we don't know what the shape of the opportunities might be. But that requires planning and requires the building of infrastructure so that you can respond to multiple potential challenges and outcomes. You have to have a decision-making process in place that's going to allow you to be effective when opportunities arise, or when your great plots fail. So George Washington dealt with this in the American Revolution. I mean, all commanders in any war deal with the uncertainty. In Washington's case, he often didn't know if he would have an army. There were so many things he had to deal with, from the basic logistics of putting an army together to thinking about, strategically, where should they fight, when should they fight, if they should fight, and then of course the tactical challenges of the actual deployment of forces once you got into the mix. I think about his attempts to figure out how to end the war. How is the American Revolution going to end? In 1780, they've been fighting since 1775. It's not clear that it's ever going to end. The British are still there. They control big chunks of the South. They've been in New York City for years. Washington's got his army, and they're safe, and he's figured out how to keep it from being destroyed. I mean, it looks like a stalemate, but he has to still plan for victory, planning to assault New York, trying to work with the French, figuring out a design, obsessing over New York. New York, New York, New York. That's going to be the thing. But then realizing that A, New York would be a really hard nut to crack, and B, there was another opportunity that was emerging. So the ability to be agile, in thinking about there's multiple ways to skin a cat. That's that leadership that's based on prudence, leadership conciliation, leadership firmness. These are qualities that any complicated situation is required in a great strategic leader. And I think in a pandemic, as much as anything, you have to be patient. You've got to be willing to adapt once you understand new things. You can't keep going on and on about one tactic that you used and keep applying it to a changing situation. Washington was incredibly adaptable throughout the American Revolution. 4 different strategic visions of how to win it throughout 4 different phases of the revolution. That's the ability to really think about what is the goal ultimately. Why are you doing what you're doing? And we need leaders right now to be very clear-minded in why we're doing what we're doing right now, and why what we're doing right now might not be the way to do things in the future based on what we learn, and be willing to adapt our approach over time. So I don't see them as, they're obviously very different. The pandemic is not a war, and I think that metaphor that people are always using against the fight against COVID is telling that we only have so many ways to kind of conceptualize this challenge. But that emphasis, I think, on patience and on the willingness to live in insecurity and a little bit of chaos, of recognizing that that's where the strength of perseverance and vision comes in. You've got to have your eyes on the prize. What is the ultimate goal? How can you manage not knowing in a way that keeps your organization motivated and successful when the opportunities to do something about it presents themselves? So, I see them as these are fundamental aspects of strategic leadership. Pandemics, it seems to me, not having that many experience going through them, it seem to require a heck of a lot of patience, and I'd love to see that emphasized more.
Doug, Rainier Bellon from the Defense Intelligence Agency would like to know what would George Washington think of America today regarding the partisanship problem with the party system?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and because I rambled on and went over time, I didn't get to read you one of my favorite quotes, which I'm going to find and read it now. Washington would hate the sense of partisanship that's so extreme that it leads to stasis. It leads to the inability to get things done. And one thing that is good, I guess, that we've seen in the crisis response to COVID in the United States is unanimity in massive pieces of legislation that have been passed, obviously with a little rancor and fighting here and there, but ultimately being passed with huge bipartisan decision making. We need nonpartisanship is what Washington wanted. He didn't like finger pointing. He didn't like blaming. He liked people working together to try to figure out a way to solve a common goal. Now, he himself failed at making this happen in his own time. A society based on liberty is going to have all kinds of different opinions, and that's what we want. And sometimes those people are going to think the other side are evil, or they think the other side are criminally insane or not able to be worked with. And Washington had this in his own cabinet with Jefferson and Hamilton, but he tried. And so I want to read what he wrote to Hamilton. Without more charity for the opinions and acts of one another in governmental matters, or some more infallible criterion by which the truth of speculative opinions before they've undergone the test of experience are to be forejudged than has yet fallen to the lot of fallibility, I believe it will be difficult, if not impracticable, to manage the reins of government or to keep the parts of it together. So basically, men aren't angels. Nobody knows everything. So we have to have charity for differences of opinion. My earnest wish and my fondest hope, therefore, is that instead of wounding suspicions and irritable charges, there may be liberal allowances, mutual forbearances, and temporizing yieldings on all sides. Under the exercise of these, matters will go on smoothly, and if possible, more prosperously. Without them, everything must rub. The wheels of government will clog, our enemies will triumph, and by throwing their weight into the disaffected scale, they accomplish the ruin of the goodly fabric we have been erecting. Washington also makes this point in his farewell address to the nation when he leaves the office of the presidency, that extreme partisanship is like a fire that can consume. Differences of opinion are important. Opposition is important within reason, because it's necessary to check and it's necessary to raise different perspective and points of view. But if it's raised to too high of a height, it can be destructive. So Washington was old-fashioned in his time. He grew up in an age in the 18th century where consensus and the notion that there's a great man who will lead things was sort of the model of politics in the British colonial world. And he dies before the 19th century. He never really sees the hyper-partisan democracy that gets created in the United States. And so he didn't quite understand it. But it's a great question. He wouldn't like what he sees right now, I think.
Doug, Luke Yatala from Malali Defense Force would like to have you shed more light on how George Washington promoted national unity, particularly for the African Americans who continue to be discriminated against after the presidency, and especially considering that the Declaration of Independence said that all men are created equal?
And that's a really good question. So what did it mean to be an American in the first birth of the United States? It was a really open question and very ambiguous. And certainly one of the great failures of the founding of the United States was to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. First of all, slavery was continued, as we know, through the Revolutionary period, but it was the first period of emancipation in Western history. Massachusetts ended slavery based on the ideas of all men being created equal, which they put into their own constitution. It was ended by a court case called the Quock-Walker case in 1782. Slavery was never allowed in places like Vermont. Many of the northern states also created laws that gradually freed people who were enslaved. And these are a mixed bag, because on the one hand, they compensate slave owners, but on the other hand, they do end slavery in a generation. One of these laws was written by Thomas Paine, the great pamphleteer of the American Revolution, again in 1782 in Pennsylvania. In Virginia's case, slavery persisted, and George Washington's own attitudes towards slavery changed quite a bit through the war. African Americans served in his army. It was an integrated army. Over 1/5 of the men who fought on the American side at the Battle of Yorktown were of African descent. They were free men. Washington had Africans and African Americans from the Marblehead Regiment serving with him as early as the Battle of Trenton. His attitude towards African Americans therefore changed because he was born in a time, where slavery was ever present in the colonial Virginia of his youth. He inherited enslaved people when he was 10 years old. And so he makes a remarkable personal journey in first abandoning slavery as an economic institution that he doesn't think is effective for his own purposes, but really the moral question of slavery, he goes on to say, is the one thing he regrets that he feels unable to master. Once he becomes president, once the Union is created as an alliance between slave-owning southern states and non-slave-owning northern states, and slavery is taken off the agenda in the 1790s as a thing that the national government can affect, and this is going to last, as we know, for many decades, Washington feels he can't do anything publicly about slavery. But as early as 1793, he's trying to figure out how to emancipate his own slaves here at Mount Vernon, the people enslaved at Mount Vernon. He never figures this out. He was trying to get English tenant farmers to come over, rent the land, and gradually transition people from slavery to freedom with a sort of apprentice systems, which is not unlike what the West Indies did in the 1830s. Ultimately, he frees all the slaves he owns in his will. And the will is important, because in the will, he makes it very clear that it is his belief that slavery is a bad system that needs to be gotten rid of, that he wants to free all the slaves he owns, and he wants to make sure that this is enforced. He wants to provide education in the trades for those who are young, and he wants to provide pensions for the elderly who no longer will be able to work. It's a personal example. It has an impact. It's particularly celebrated by the African American community in Philadelphia. You can see there's a great sermon by Reverend Allen of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, which is really the leaders of the free African American community in the United States in that early period. Reverend Allen knew Washington as president of the United States. And so Allen, as an African American, he celebrates Washington and basically says this wipes the final stain off his legacy. And Allen, very much, to get to your question, puts it into the context of national American identity, that African Americans can aspire to the same values that are supposed to charge, the values of the United States of America, and that they can claim the Declaration of Independence as their own and attack slavery where it exists and attack limitations on the civil rights of African Americans where they exist. Now, interestingly, maybe it's not interesting, it's tragic or sad, but free blacks had more rights in the period of George Washington's presidency than they would have a generation later. So free blacks with a certain amount of property could vote in New York, for instance, in the 1790s, and that has to do with the laws of New York, and every state was different. But not every white man could vote in the 1790s. You had to have a certain amount of property. What happens in the United States is that there's a real racialization of national identity in the period really after. I mean, it starts in George Washington's time, but it really grows after Washington in the early 19th century, where American means white American, and African Americans lose more and more civil rights. They lose the right to vote in the new Constitution that New York writes in the 1820s. And there's this whole period of Constitution writing in the 1820s and 30s where these original revolutionary constitutions are reformed. And on the one hand, they become more democratic because they allow for all white men to vote, no matter whether they have any property or not. But on the other hand, they become more systematically racist in the sense that they limit that right to white men explicitly, when in many cases they didn't. Interestingly, free black communities don't really exist in any size in the British colonial period. So in 1782, for instance, at the end of the American Revolution in the Chesapeake, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware combined, you have very small numbers of free blacks, free African Americans. You have about 5,000. By 1810, you have 50,000. Now that's a product of revolutionary emancipations of African Americans that happened because of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Quakers in Virginia particularly are active in this, and Washington himself, of course, frees his slaves. That gets clamped down on by 1806, 1807, 1808. Laws are passed in Virginia and Maryland and other places that don't allow masters to emancipate their slaves anymore. They have to get a special bill from the legislature to do it. So there's this strange period of opportunity in the revolutionary crisis of American independence, which allows for some liberalization in these colonial attitudes about slavery and race, and allows for people to imagine potentials for a more integrated, racially equal society. But these are more, these never really play out. And ultimately, those large free black communities are seen as a threat to the existing systems of slavery that are, by the early 19th century, really growing because of the spread of cotton into the Deep South, and therefore, and the end of the international African slave trade, which ends in 1808. Because now a lot of these enslaved people in the Upper South, they don't have enough work really for them because the population, again, has doubled every 20 years. But this becomes a huge source of an internal slave trade down into the Deep South, from Virginia, Maryland region down into Mississippi and Alabama. And so Washington, has no control kind of over those demographic trends, but that kind of helps understand and shape the reaction against the racial liberalization that had happened haltingly, and not universally, but nevertheless was a part of that revolutionary founding of the United States. And so that, I think, is, there's a lot of good stuff written on this, but it's a really great and important question. As I said, Washington is oftentimes, like the Declaration of Independence, putting out aspirational values that help define what America could be. When he makes the statement about the Jews in Newport, that everybody has a natural right to their worship in their way. Again, even the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut couldn't worship in their own way at that same time. So it was an aspirational value, but it certainly is, I think, from our perspective, we would have wanted Washington to do more, but he ultimately was a man of the 18th century. And in his role as a strategic leader of a new country, his most pressing mission, he felt, was not, enforcing perfect uniform justice, but rather making sure that the Union survived.
And Doug, just time for one more question. This one from Will Cooper, U.S. Air Force. You mentioned that George Washington was well aware of the media. What relationship do you believe he envisioned between the media and the federal government?
Well, that's a really good question, the relationship between the media and the federal government. So George Washington understood that this is a government and this is a society in which public opinion is crucial. Now, in the 18th century, they didn't think about polls. Public opinion wasn't something that you could quantify, and I don't think it is today either, although we try with our different methods. But they understood that public opinion really shaped the effectiveness of leadership, right? You could not just dictate to the Americans what was going to happen and tell them what to do. You had to, rule through legislation, which is based on voting, which is based on the idea that these people are representing people. Now, Washington did not like any kind of antagonism to his administration outside of the normal processes of voting and elections. He thought, look, if we've got a government with elections, that's the place where you can elect different people if you don't like what we're doing. Don't, form these extra societies that are going to criticize, and the newspapers, become ultimately these organizers of party opposition in the United States. So newspapers more and more take on a partisan character in his time period. In fact, there's a great episode in the height of the French Revolutionary Scare, when there's mobs around Philadelphia singing French Revolutionary songs, clamoring for war against Britain, saying they should guillotine President Washington and drag him out of the house. There's actually a print that circulated in Philadelphia with a picture of Washington being guillotined. And Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, mischievously, I think, brings a copy of this into a cabinet meeting, and George Washington loses his mind. Thomas Jefferson writes all about this in his diary of the time, called the ANAS, A-N-A-S, if you want to look it up online, Jefferson's ANAS. And in it, he describes an episode where Washington, sees this print and just loses it. He's like, they accuse me of being a monarch. I know I wouldn't take the title of Emperor of the World. I'd rather be at Mount Vernon. I'd rather be home and retired. And the only day I regretted having a second term in office was every day I've been in office in the second term. And he rants and raves. And he says this publisher, Freneau, publishes this radical newspaper, and he sends copies of it to my office, 3 copies a day, as if I'm going to be a distributor of his paper. And this is all written down by Jefferson. And you get the sense of a man who's really frustrated. Now, on the other hand, Washington never went out and, said, okay, get a bunch of guys and go break up that printing press and throw it into the river, or let's arrest this person and put him in jail. So there was a limit. He did understand that there would be, these complaints about him out there. And so Washington's attitude was, the press is something we have. He hated it. He thought it was not fair to him when it was critical, but it was crucial to him when he wanted to get his message across. I mean, you're looking at an image here. You're probably just looking at me, but if Matt showed the PowerPoint, you're looking at an image of his farewell address to the country, in which he used the media of the day, the press, to get out his message. He used the media to send his visage around, to send out his thoughts when he traveled around to the country, to report on his travels around the country. So he used the media just like he used public performances, but he also hated being criticized. And what president hasn't? Well, so thank you very much. I'm being waved at, and you're going to wrap it up now. I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope to be able to come back and see you all in person. I know you all will graduate this year, but congratulations and thank you for your service. And start thinking about the leadership challenges of the next 8 months, because it's going to get harder, I think, as we start to move past the finger pointing and start to think about what is the world we want to create on the backside of this. The Marshall Plan, is one of the great things we did in world history. And in some ways, it was a lot harder to do that than to fight World War II. It's going to clear what you need to do in World War II. Mobilize the nation, put armies together, kill the enemy, destroy them, win. But then what do you do afterward? The solution was the Marshall Plan. It helped bring back Europe to prosperity and democracy, Western Europe at least, and allowed the United States to be a positive force in the world. What is our Marshall Plan going to look like at the end of this COVID-19? That's the job of you all. Think big and think about the ways we can work together better. Thank you so much.